So now we're in August, named after our greatest emperor. I mean, no shade to Shao Kahn, but it is what it is. Are you a fan? I mean, I don't know if you're into mythology or whatever. Anyway, what did you check out this month?
I watched Chris Claremont's X-Men from 2013, which was a documentary that was focusing entirely on his original run from 1975 to the early 90s, because he did come back in the mid-2000s, and then I think he came back again later. Well, because he did X-Men Forever, I think it was called, which was continuing on from where he left off in the 90s. I haven't read that, so I don't know if it's good or not, but either way, this was focusing on that first run, which is where pretty much everything that we think of with X-Men, other than what was originally introduced by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, pretty much everything comes from Chris Claremont. So the documentary was mostly just snippets of interviews with him, Ann Nocenti, who was the editor for a while, and Louise Simonson, who I think she was also an editor, but she was also writing X Factor. And I think, she took over New Mutants after Chris Claremont stopped writing that. And then there were some interviews with Jim Shooter, which was kind of awkward because the other three in their interviews, they just kept shitting on him with everything they were saying. And then you'd cut to Jim Shooter and he's like, yeah, making comics is hard. Like, sometimes you gotta, make the right decision and whatever. And then he cuts back to them and they're like, yeah, that guy was a dick. Like, I hated that guy. Working for him sucked. Like, blah, blah, blah. All the problems came from him. And then you cut back to him and he's like, yeah, it's been a rewarding experience and whatever.
Sounds like pretty typical management.
Yeah. It was making me think of, imagining him watching the documentary after it was done and just being like, I thought that was a good interview. And then he goes and watches it and it's just like, shit. I didn't like that they did the thing that a lot of documentaries do where they interview a bunch of people that are just talking about how great whatever the subject matter is.
Yeah, and they had nothing to do with the actual creation of it.
Yeah, just a bunch of other... I mean, some of them were real writers and stuff, real comic book writers, but it's like, I don't care what your opinion is. I already know that X-Men was good because I read it, and that's why I'm watching the documentary. So it was okay. As a documentary, it was nothing special, but it's cool to see those interviews with these people. And it was very sad to hear about how things fell apart and how... I don't remember which editor it was. I want to say it was but I don't want to specifically say this is the guy, because it could be wrong, but I think that was him who came in and was like the one that kind of decided that the artists were the ones driving the sales and that the writers didn't matter. And that's kind of where things completely collapsed. Although really they weren't that great getting toward the end of the 80s. Well, you read those.
Yeah.
X-Men was already kind of starting to go all over the place. And they talk about that too a little bit, about how there were so many different plot lines running that it will take years to get back to some of them sometimes.
Okay, well, at least they admit that.
Yeah. So if you're a fan of X-Men and Chris Claremont, I would definitely recommend checking it out. I watched The IT Crowd Season 4 and the final episode, which I think was called The Final Episode, which was from 2010. So I've talked about the show before. It was still good, more of the same, still recommended. The final episode didn't feel like a final episode. It was just maybe 45 minutes, so it was like 1.5 times the usual length. But other than that, it just felt like another episode. So it doesn't really come to an ending or anything, but it's a good show. It's a comedy. I feel like it doesn't really matter for something like that. I enjoyed it.
That's weird, because you don't normally watch comedies, let alone enjoy them.
I know. I mean, like I said, the first time I tried it, that first episode, I really did not like it. But I'm glad I went back to it because I did enjoy it. And I have some more comedy stuff to talk about later, too. I watched several Doctor Who serials, and I found out that it seems that all the ones on Tubi are just the ones that are completely intact, because a lot of them are now missing parts or missing altogether sometimes. So they basically just put up all the ones that are not missing anything.
They should just do a new Doctor Who serial where all of the history of the Doctor from previous incarnations has been lost, and it's like a tongue-in-cheek thing, and they have to go find the history,
Oh, don't give them ideas, because then they'll just recreate some of these old ones that, but do it with shitty CGI. And
I'm sure they've done that already.
Yeah, that's probably true. All of the ones I watched were from 1964. I watched 2 more from Season 1, which were the Aztecs and the Sensorites. The Aztecs, I thought, was kind of boring. They end up in Aztec times and are mistaken for gods. The only thing that was interesting was there was kind of like a moral conundrum kind of situation where they're going to sacrifice this guy to their gods, but since they think these people are their gods, one of them says, well, why don't we stop the sacrifice and not let this guy get killed? But the doctor is like, we can't change history or whatever, which I'm sure they change history all the time. But yeah, it was kind of an interesting situation, but overall I thought it was kind of boring. And then the Sensorites, the cool part of the Sensorites, the part I really liked was at the very end of the first episode, when they introduced the Sensorites, who are these aliens, they're looking out a window into space, and one of them kind of floats up in front of the window with his creepy head up against the glass. And it was really cool, and I was really excited to see what was going to happen next. And then they basically turned out to just be humans that look different. And that was disappointing. And so basically, they've had bad experiences with humans in the past and don't trust them and whatever. But then one of them ends up getting killed, and they blame one of the doctor's companions. But then the doctor has to prove that it was really one of their own that committed the murder. So it was okay. But other than the design of the aliens, it was not really that interesting. Then the next one was the first serial of season 2, which was called Planet of Giants, and it was only 3 parts. So I guess there was one earlier that was only 2 parts, but it was a relatively short one. And it was easily the best one so far, in my opinion. They land in London, but something goes wrong with the TARDIS to where they emerge having been shrunken down. And basically they're having to get around and survive while they're super small. And at the same time, there's a subplot going on involving some people that have created a super powerful insecticide that it turns out is too powerful and is dangerous. And there's some kind of gangster activity involved and people are shooting each other and whatever. I didn't really pay attention to that half because it was not interesting.
There is no such thing as an insecticide that is too strong. They outnumber us like 2 trillion to 1.
Part of what made it cool was that they actually had props of like giant ants and a giant earthworm and just giant stuff in general. It was really cool. I was really surprised that they went that far with all that stuff. And they even had a fly puppet that actually moved and everything. And they only showed it for a couple of shots, because I'm sure if they showed it too much, it would have not worked. But it was really cool. I was really impressed. And it makes me wonder how much of that stuff they might have pulled from somewhere else, because it seems weird that they would put it into something usually so low budget and kind of haphazardly thrown together is usually how it feels. But it was really cool. So that was what made this one stand out. I wasn't paying super close attention to the actual story, so I didn't understand how they fixed things at the end. They seem to just go back to the TARDIS and then everything is okay, so I don't know. Because one of them even she came into contact with the insecticide, and she was getting sick or whatever, but then she just was okay when they enlarged her, so I don't know. I watched Willard from 1971. Have you seen this movie?
Did they remake it?
Yes.
With Crispin Glover?
With Crispin Glover.
I've seen that one.
Okay, I've not seen that one. So I always thought this movie was about a guy with a psychic connection to rats that he uses to have them kill people. But there's nothing supernatural or sci-fi about it. It's just normal rats. And this guy just kind of befriends them in a, I don't know, normal way. You know, the way you normally befriend rats.
Of course.
And I can see why it's regarded as a horror movie, but for the majority of it, it's just him going through his life, his shitty life, dealing with his shitty boss and shitty family members. I thought the acting was very good for the most part. You have Bruce Davison as Willard, who plays Senator Kelly in the X-Men movies. So I've only seen him in more recent stuff like that. And he always plays like a douchebag asshole character.
Yeah, usually.
But in this movie, he was very sympathetic. It was interesting seeing him play somebody very different. And then his boss was played by Ernest Borgnine, who I thought did a really good job, a particularly good job. I liked how much character there was to everything, to all the characters. They all have a lot of personality, and you really sympathize with Willard and his crappy life. It's from the early 70s, and it feels like an independent movie, so you get some kind of awkward, low-budget 70s editing and camera work. So from a technical side of things, it was a little bit kind of rough, but I thought it was a pretty good movie. I've never understood people that are afraid of rats. Like, I don't know. To me, it's a weird thing to be afraid of. I get spiders. I get, I like snakes, but I get being afraid of snakes. But to me, rats, it's always been a weird horror subject for me. It's not something that I can really understand why some people are afraid of rats.
I mean, rats carry diseases.
Yeah, but being afraid of diseases is different from being afraid of the actual animals. And I think a lot of people are afraid of the animals.
Yeah.
But, I don't know. They're mammals. Like, to me, it's like just like small dogs. I don't know.
Okay, I don't think I've ever heard anyone say a rat is a small dog. But
yeah, right. Maybe that's not a good comparison. Maybe like squirrels. I don't think most people are afraid of squirrels, To me, it's not a big jump from that to Rats.
I mean, you're basically just rehashing the opening from Inglourious Bastards.
What is it? I don't remember them talking about rats.
Christoph Waltz's whole opening monologue for that whole movie is about rats and squirrels and why we don't like rats.
Okay. I guess I need to watch it again. I don't remember that. Okay. Well, either way, I don't get it. But like I said, it's mostly not a horror movie. It doesn't really turn into one until kind of toward the end. It reminded me of Carrie in some ways. It's kind of the same overall arc. So again, the only reason I watched it was because of its kind of cultural significance in a way, because I just hear people talk about it sometimes. I see it pop up in different places. And it was never something that interested me in terms of the subject matter, but it turned out to be pretty good. I think because it's not about rats attacking people and stuff, although that does kind of happen toward the end. I wouldn't really go out of my way to recommend it or anything, but I thought it was pretty good. I watched Absolute Power from 1997, which was a Clint Eastwood starring and directed movie based on a book by David Baldacci. So I've never read anything by David Baldacci, but this movie was pretty much what I would expect. As a writer, he feels very much like not James Cameron, James Patterson, as just kind of a mainstream generic thriller writer that probably writes in really short chapters with really simple language for people that have trouble reading normal books. And I can tell you from experience that a lot of people that read his books don't even know what his name is. I mean, a lot of people that read James Patterson books don't know that he doesn't actually write most of the books with his names on them, even though they will have other people's names on the cover too. But the people that read this kind of stuff, they don't care about what they're reading. I don't understand the motivation behind them being alive. But this movie was just as crappy as I would have expected. So Clint Eastwood plays an aging master thief, because of course he does. He breaks into E.G. Marshall's house to steal some stuff. But then he sees Gene Hackman come in, who's playing the president, and he's going to have sex with E.G. Marshall's wife. But then he starts getting violent, and it seems like he's going to strangle her, so she starts fighting back, and she ends up getting shot by Secret Service. And they try to cover everything up, but Clint Eastwood steals the weapon that she was going to attack Gene Hackman with, which has blood on it and both of their fingerprints and whatever. So it becomes a scenario where Clint Eastwood is on the run from the president's goons, including Scott Glenn. So there are a lot of people in this movie that deserve to be in better movies than this. And then you have Ed Harris as the inspector who's in charge of the case, and it's one of those really dumb situations where he keeps running into Clint Eastwood and they keep having civil conversations, and it's kind of like, I know you did it, I know you're involved, but I can't prove it, so I gotta let you go this time. And it's just so many dumb, contrived situations to try to ramp up drama, and it was incredibly ridiculous, and just, it was stupid is the word I would use for this movie. It was so dumb. And then you also have a subplot with Clint Eastwood trying to reconnect with his daughter, who's played by Laura Linney. And she's like, oh, Dad, don't tell me you're back to thieving again and whatever. It was incredibly dumb. It felt like they went to the writer of some generic police procedural and said, write a full movie. And he was like, all I know is how to write this shitty TV show. So then he just expanded an episode to a full movie. So I don't know if David Baldacci worked on anything like that, but that's what it felt like. Lots of bad dialogue, lots of scenes that went on for way too long. I think this movie was over 2 hours, and you literally could have cut probably half of it out, and the movie would have been better. It still would have been stupid. And there were lots of things that didn't make sense. So yeah, I would definitely not recommend it. This movie was absolutely terrible. I couldn't believe how bad it was for being such a big production with all these big people on it. So from there, I went on to another crappy, generic thriller movie from 1997 involving the U.S. president, which was Air Force One.
Oh, see, people like Air Force One.
Did you talk about this one before?
No, I did not.
Okay. So, I liked this movie. I saw this movie in theaters, and I thought it was awesome, which is, looking back on it, is weird, because I don't know why I would have liked something like this back then.
I guess the marketing was successful then.
I don't know. You've got Harrison Ford as the president, and Air Force One gets hijacked by Gary Oldman, who I kept forgetting was in this movie, because again, he's a good actor. He doesn't fit in with something like this, but every once in a while they cut to him, and I was like, oh yeah. I have a note that William H. Macy was really bad in it. So, I don't know. William H. Macy is a weird actor, and that's all I'll say about him.
Yeah, he only fits into specific roles, but when he does, he fits very well.
Yeah, and this was not one of them. Jerry Goldsmith did the music, which was very disappointing, because right from the opening titles and everything, it's this super generic and almost self-parody, like patriotic, stereotypical American music. I don't know. It was so dumb, and it perfectly fit the movie. This one was not anywhere near as bad as Absolute Power. It was more just super generic and bland. But it was bad. I would still put it on the bad side.
Bigger budget, too, I'm sure.
Yeah, and 1997, you already had some good CGI stuff by this point, but it seems the shot that this movie is known for nowadays is the shot of Air Force One crashing into the water.
I can see it in my head.
Yeah, that was definitely the highlight of the movie, but, not for the right reasons. So I would definitely not recommend checking this out. So I figured since I watched Willard, I might as well watch the sequel, which was called Ben, from 1972. This one retconned the first one to say that Willard was keeping a diary, because otherwise there'd be no way for anybody to know what happened in the first movie. So you've got the authorities hunting the rats, and this kid meets Ben, the leader of the rats, and they become friends. This was not a bad movie, but there were 3 big problems with it. Number 1, it was completely unnecessary. The first movie stood on its own and would have been better left alone. Number 2, it was too unfocused. The first movie revolved entirely around Willard and really developed him as a character, made you feel for him, and that's what the movie was about. But this movie gives us this new main character who's also alone and feels like an outcast in his own way, partially just because he's young and doesn't seem to have any friends his age. And that part of the movie worked well enough, but it took way too long to actually get to him, and over the course of the movie it keeps going back to the authorities and scenes of the rats attacking people for pretty much no reason. And that stuff was not interesting because there's no characters there. There's nobody to focus on. It felt like they said, people want a horror movie about rats attacking people, so we're going to stick that stuff in there, even if it doesn't really fit or make sense. So if this movie was just about the kid, like the first movie was just about Willard, it could have been a lot better. But since it doesn't spend enough time on him and Ben, that side of it ends up feeling underdeveloped, and the entire movie ends up feeling underdeveloped. And then the third big problem was that it doesn't come to a conclusion. It just kind of ends. There's no arc for the kid. There's no arc for Ben. I don't know how there really could be because Ben's just there. But his storyline, the storyline with the kid and Ben, and the storyline with the authorities, they kind of converge at the end, and it just devolves into what sounds cool but is not. A bunch of shots of people using flamethrowers and shotguns to kill rats in the sewers. And then you cut back at the very end to the kid and Ben and their storyline, and then the movie's just over. And it was so weird. I didn't think that was going to be the end, but then the credits just start. And it's also weird that Michael Jackson not only sang the title song, but put out an entire album called Ben. This is such a weird movie to be like, yeah, you know what, I'm going to associate myself with that by putting out an entire album. And that was before Michael Jackson was, he was already successful from the Jackson 5, and even pretty much as soon as he went solo, but, he wasn't as big as he would become, but it's still just weird. So it wasn't a bad movie, despite everything I just said, but it's not really worth watching either. It was mostly just disappointing. So if you're going to watch one of these, I would just stick to the first one. I watched Waterworld from 1995.
All right.
Okay, so you've seen this?
Yeah.
Okay. Clearly, the idea behind this movie was, let's make Mad Max, but wet. And it went just as badly as it sounds like that would. Kevin Costner is basically playing Aquaman in the future where the Earth is flooded, and there's this little girl with tattoos on her back, and for some unexplained reason, as far as I could tell, people think that the tattoos somehow lead to a place that they refer to as a single capitalized word, dry land. So this is very much a movie where you can feel them saying, oh, we're going to come up with all this lore that people are going to mythologize and just whatever. And they were trying way too hard, and none of it worked. It was not good. And for no reason at all, Kevin Costner has to help the little girl and her adopted mother do something. I'm not even sure. They're trying to get to dry land or whatever, but I don't know. There's no reason for anything to happen in this movie. And I knew right from the start that it wasn't going to be good because you start out with a narrator, and I'm pretty sure he's only there at the very beginning, and it's the freaking movie trailer voice guy.
Don LaFontaine?
Yeah, so right from the start, you're making your movie feel like not even a movie. It feels like you're watching a trailer. It was distracting, it was weird, and it was dumb. Dennis Hopper plays the bad guy, and I don't know, it's up there with like Super Mario Brothers and, well, a typical Dennis Hopper movie from the era. He's just weird, over the top, ridiculous. there were some funny moments with him, intentionally funny, but it just nothing felt like it worked in this movie.
I still drop the line "Adios, cousins" when I'm leaving sometimes, just because of this movie. This movie always shows up on lists of the worst movies ever made, and it's nowhere close to that. It's not good, but it doesn't belong on those lists compared to other shit that exists.
Right. It was bad, but I was surprised at how generic it was. I mean, it obviously, the reason it shows up on those lists is because it was such a big production that was so hyped up and everything.
Right.
So it's more of just its high profile.
I mean, they had everything going for it. They even had a Virtual Boy game tie-in. How can you lose?
So I read a little bit about the background where they had a bunch of sets built and then a hurricane came through and like wrecked everything. And that was after Steven Spielberg was like, hey, don't shoot in the ocean. It's not going to work.
Right, because he had experience from Jaws, right?
Yeah. So there's a lot of design work and, effort that went into this movie. But all of the sets, I think part of it is just the cinematography, but all of the sets feel like sets. And all of the costumes feel like costumes. And all of the props feel like props. And part of it is because the design work doesn't make sense. It doesn't make real world sense. It doesn't make sense in the world of the movie. It just feels like they said, oh, we need to come up with an interesting design. Even to the point of, and this was frustrating, they have like mechanical contraptions that have to actually work because they use them in the movie. Like they move and they do whatever they're supposed to do. But instead of just showing them the way they work and designing them that way, they design them to work a certain way, but then they design them to look a different way that doesn't really make sense. And just conceptually, a lot of it doesn't make sense. It was very frustrating. Like you look at something like Mad Max and all the set dressing and the stuff on the cars and everything. It feels like it makes sense in that world. Like it serves a purpose. But in this movie, it feels like they just said, hey, this would be cool. But it doesn't make sense visually or conceptually.
Well, if Kevin Costner knows anything, it's how to produce movies that deliver. You can put up a picture of that recent one he just did that completely bombed.
Yeah, which one was that?
Something Frontier? I can't remember what it's called. Hang on.
Yeah, all of his movies, all of his big movies like that blend together.
Horizon.
Okay. See, when I was watching this, when I went into this, I was thinking of The Postman, and I was thinking it was one of those Kevin Costner directed movies, and it wasn't. So yeah, I guess he just makes a lot of these big failure movies. I haven't seen Dances with Wolves, so I know, that one won all the awards back in the day.
Yeah, that probably boosted him up, and he said, yeah, time to do Waterworld.
Yeah, and there were a lot of bad composite shots in this movie that were very distracting. And not just bad in terms of the way they looked, like in terms of the actual compositing, but the way they were put in the movie. It was like, why would this part be moving this way when this other part is moving this way? Like, again, it didn't make real world sense, and it was distracting and weird. And then there was the giant CGI sea monster that shows up for one CGI shot, and I think one practical shot, which had no explanation. Kevin Costner's mutation had no explanation, and it didn't matter. Just the entire movie felt pointless, and just, it felt like, for all of the action scenes, where again, all of the stunts feel like stunts. They feel like movie stunts. But it was making me think of like when you go to SeaWorld or something and they have like the Batman show, and you go and you watch like the Batman performance. That's what it felt like. But it was a full movie and it was way too long and it was kind of boring and it sucked.
They had a Batman performance at SeaWorld?
Yeah, there was...
Does SeaWorld even exist anymore?
I definitely saw some kind of Batman Aqua Spectacular or whatever. You would think they'd go with Aquaman or something. Well, nobody would know. Nobody would go to it if it was Aquaman. So anyway, yeah, it was not good. So speaking of not good, I watched a movie from 1978 called The Bees.
So just an animal-themed month for you, pretty much.
I guess. I mean, Kevin Costner is technically an animal, so yes.
I mean, he's going to pull his patron support now.
He pays below the bottom tier, so I'm not going to shed any tears over that.
Well, he had to mortgage his house for Horizon, okay? He's a little short on funds.
If he wants to make bad life choices, that's on him.
His support just... No, I can't think of a good joke. I actually had a joke earlier for, who's the Senator Kelly actor?
Bruce Davison.
Yeah, and what movie were you talking about with him in it?
Willard.
Yeah, so I was going to make a joke of like, so it sounds like he could hold his water for this movie or something. But that doesn't really make sense.
Yeah.
It was the only thing I could think of with water in it, because he melts or whatever in X-Men.
Yeah, yeah.
His performance holds water. Is that something you could say?
I mean, technically, it's something you could say.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah, I don't know. I think people would get the meaning, but yeah, I don't know.
Because I was thinking of something else for something about. Okay, you know what? Let's just continue with whatever the hell you watched.
Yeah. So this was a Mexican production, but it's entirely in English. You've got John Saxon and John Carradine as a couple of people that work with bees. There's also some woman in there. John Carradine was surprisingly lively for how old he was at this point, which is really the only good thing I can say about this movie, and I don't know if that's even a good thing.
Is it a horror movie?
Yes, I guess. I mean, if a movie about killer bees killing people is a horror movie, I guess.
Well, I mean, I was thinking it could be like these three people, like, just living together and developing relationships and stuff, and there just happen to be bees.
You'd be expecting too much. So you've got killer bees being imported from South America to the U.S., and they get loose.
Typical. In
really goofy ways, and that's the movie.
And instead of covered in pollen, they're all covered in cocaine.
Yeah, that's what makes them frenzy so much. And toward the very end of the movie, this was completely unexpected. There was nothing like this hinted at or anything in this movie that would have led me to expect this. At the very end, you find out the bees have developed intelligence, and they send John Saxon and whoever the female woman is, whoever the woman is.
Female.
Yeah, I was going to say the female, like, whatever her role is, but I don't know what it was. They send them to, like, the United Nations or something to give them a message from the bees saying, you're going to share the world with us or we're going to kill you. And I was expecting some kind of, like, final scene of their reaction or their some kind of like, oh, I guess we got to work together or something. But then the movie just ends. It just cuts off.
No, there should have been a final scene of the United Nations table, and there would just be a giant bee sitting at one of the seats.
Oh, that would have been a lot cooler than what we got. So the awesome poster is the only good thing about it. The music was unintentionally funny right from the opening titles. It felt like the person who did the music didn't know how to make it scary or tense or ominous or anything, because you could tell they were trying, but it's so upbeat and so 70s that it was funny. At points in the movie, there was a lot of stock footage of people running around from clearly some other older movie, and lots of footage of planes and helicopters going down, of like real footage that they just kind of superimposed swarms of bees and stuff. Including, there was a shot in the movie Airplane when they were watching a shot of a plane going down on whatever movie they're watching. That same shot was in this movie, which was funny too. And I read that supposedly, I talked about the movie The Swarm a ways back with Michael Caine, which was also really bad. Yeah. And apparently Warner Brothers paid the people behind this movie to delay the release of their movie so that The Swarm could come out first, so it wouldn't impact that. But they're both pretty much equally bad.
The old Bugs Life versus Ants, just before that happened.
So I said with The Swarm that it could have been a good, bad movie if you had cut out some of the boring stuff in between and it wasn't so long. I would say the same thing about this one. There's just too much dullness in between the really funny parts. So there are some really funny parts, but I can't recommend it even to those people. I would say just stay away from this one. I watched 30 Seconds Over Tokyo from 1944. So this was coming out during the war, and it's about the air raids on Tokyo following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And Spencer Tracy gets top billing, even though he's only in the movie for maybe like 6 minutes or something spread out over the runtime. Really, the main character is played by Van Johnson, who was way too much. His acting is ridiculous and goofy and really threatened to ruin the movie. It's very much, in general, just like old Hollywood style acting. You look at Spencer Tracy and he's acting like a normal person. You look at Van Johnson and he looks like a f***ing cartoon teddy bear. It's pretending to feel pain from his severed leg and whatever and blah, blah, blah. So the only part of this movie that I really liked was the actual bombing raid scene, which was really short. The movie's called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. It was really short, but really effective. But the movie overall is really long. So it was interesting the way they did that, and I thought it worked from that angle. And they were clearly trying to treat it as this big epic thing with all these subplots of whatever. I mean, it's mostly Van Johnson and his wife and their relationship and how this is all affecting them and whatever. And her acting was also a bit much. But I don't know. I mean, it's an old movie. That's what you get sometimes. But I thought it was too much. Things were just overdrawn. So it was okay. I wouldn't particularly recommend it, but I can't say it was bad. It was okay. I watched Barbershop from 2002. So I guess this is a comedy, technically. I mean, I think really to qualify it would have to be funny. Back when this movie came out, I remember seeing the trailers and saying, that's a movie I want to see. And I'm pretty sure I even bought it on DVD. But it took me, 22 years to actually get around to watching it. It was not good. If I were to describe the plot, I would say it was a bunch of random people doing random things. And sometimes a barbershop is involved, or scenes take place in a barbershop.
So basically a documentary of real life.
Well, that would have been more interesting because, oh man.
I mean, I don't know. My life involves a lot of random people doing random things, and once in a while a barbershop is involved.
Yeah, but I'm sure your life doesn't involve as much bad acting as this movie had.
Well...
From people other than you trying to pass off as a normal person.
What? Heard I never something so awkward.
So, there's not much to say about it because there's not much in this movie. There are things that are supposed to be jokes, but they're not. It was reminding me of Rush Hour and the way, of Rush Hour 2, and the way Chris Tucker is supposed to be funny just because he's there and because he's acting goofy. That's kind of how this movie was. And in particular, you had freaking Cedric the Entertainer, who can be funny, but in here, he's playing an old man with really bad old man hair and makeup and whatever. I don't know if he had makeup, but really bad old man hair. For the most part, the movie is it's supposed to be funny because of the dialogue and the interactions. But he's supposed to be funny because he's being super goofy and ridiculously over the top. And it doesn't even fit in with the movie that he's in. And it wasn't funny. It was dumb. And even at points where there's kind of like, I don't know, the what I guess is supposed to be like the core plot is you have freaking Keith David, who, again, good actors being in really bad movies. Keith David is the villain who is he's going to buy the barbershop and turn it into like a men's club or whatever. And Ice Cube is the owner of the barbershop, and for some reason he agrees to sell it, but then he's like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. It doesn't make any sense. None of the characters make any sense, and it's like there are all these dumb subplots of characters having their own arguments with each other and their own interactions, but none of it goes anywhere, and none of it is funny. So yeah, I would skip this movie, just like pretty much every other movie I mentioned so far this month. Clearly it was a good month. And somehow this spawned an entire franchise where you have sequels and I think like spin-offs and even a TV series. This movie sucked. And if anyone here has seen the mid-2000s Fantastic Four and how bad that movie was, that's the same director, Tim Story. So you know what kind of movie you're going to get. And I should have known too because I knew that was the same director. So yeah, a big disappointment. I don't remember why I wanted to see it back then. I guess it must have had good trailers or something, but it was not funny.
I guess the marketing was successful. I think you're more susceptible than you want to admit.
Maybe.
I also noticed you subconsciously stuck the word Spawn into a movie starring Keith David, which is understandable.
Yeah, see, again, Keith David, there are much better roles for Keith David than freaking Barbershop.
I mean, I assume there's an alley next to the barbershop or around it. You know, I could just see Keith David cornering someone. He's like, stay out of these alleys.
That would have made it a much cooler movie than it was. So someone in the comments suggested we watch The Seven Faces of Dr. Lao.
Yeah.
But I couldn't find it. So instead of The Seven Faces of Dr. Lao, I watched The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T. I figured that was close enough.
Is that related in any way or just...
No.
Okay.
This was from 1953, and it was the only live-action movie written by Dr. Seuss. Not based on Dr. Seuss, but actually written by Dr. Seuss. So you have a young boy who is unhappy with having to take piano lessons from a tyrannical instructor named Dr. Terwilliger.
Relatable.
And he dreams that he is in a fantasy world where he goes to a music school that is run like a prison by the same Dr. Terwilliger, and he spends the runtime trying to escape. And it's a musical, technically.
Interesting.
So everything in the visual design, from the props, to the sets, to the matte paintings, to the characters, is made to look like something from a Dr. Seuss book, which sounds a lot more interesting than it is. So 3 big problems. Number 1, Nothing much happens, and the movie is pretty dang boring. If I wasn't doing other stuff while I was trying to watch this movie, I guarantee I would have fallen asleep. The story being simple isn't a bad thing in itself, but things need to happen to pull the story along for the movie to have a reason to exist. So it was making me think of similar movies that are kind of trying to go for the same thing but actually succeed, like Baron Munchausen or Willy Wonka. I was thinking of Willy Wonka a lot. But this movie just felt very slow and aimless, and it was relying on that sense of whimsy, but there's just not enough to make it interesting for the full movie. I could see it maybe, I don't know if working, but being a lot more effective as a short film. But as a movie, it was boring. Problem number 2. From the visual side, it was boring. The design work is cool, but they have these big sets that they keep pulling the camera back so you can see everything, but there's nothing in the set. It's literally just a big room with like a Dr. Seuss shaped door over here and like piano keys going all along the wall over here. But then there's just this big empty space that they don't do anything with. There's nothing to look at. There's nothing interesting happening. And it's, again, just boring. The third big problem was the musical numbers, which are just as bland as everything else. The lyrics, I think, would have worked a lot better just on paper, because again, it's Dr. Seuss. But the music backing them up doesn't do anything. It feels like they said, well, we need to have a song here, so let's just come up with some generic music and stick it in.
That's too bad.
Yeah, and the numbers themselves, in terms of their placement in the movie, feel random, and they don't add anything to it. You know, it's not like this song kind of expresses this character's emotion. I guess they did that a little bit, but not in an effective way, not in an interesting way. And I read that the original screening of the movie had 20 musical numbers. They got such a poor response that they cut 9 of them out,
Oof.
which says a lot about how important and how, interesting they were. So yeah, it was a really boring movie, really disappointing. It sounds a lot more interesting than it is. It wasn't a truly bad movie. It was just really boring. It just had nothing going on. So I would not recommend it. I would say maybe watch a trailer or something if you're curious, but that's it. It was not good. Speaking of a Terry Gilliam movie, Baron Munchausen, I said, you know what? I want to watch one of his fantasy movies. So I watched one that I hadn't seen before, which was Jabberwocky from 1977. So you have a monster that's terrorizing the countryside. That's kind of in the background for most of the movie. And you have this guy that wants to move from the countryside to the city to try to find a better job so he can get money and marry this fat girl. And that's not me throwing that in there. That's like her character is that she's fat, which is supposed to be funny, which again, comedies. This is technically a comedy. And it was funny. There were parts of it that were funny. There were parts of it that I did enjoy. But too much of it was, hey, let's take this joke and stretch it out over 5 minutes. And sometimes the joke isn't really that funny to begin with. So there were funny moments, but overall it was just too long. Again, kind of like a running theme with this month. It felt pointless. It felt like, why is this scene here? Why does this movie exist? I was questioning the motivation behind doing this movie and this story. It almost kind of felt like they came up with the premise and they said, we'll come up with funny stuff along the way. And they did, but not enough. And again, some of the jokes just weren't funny. A lot of them weren't funny. And then at the end, you do see the monster, and it was kind of cool. I liked the design. The execution wasn't great. But even then, it felt like, again, this is primarily a comedy, but now you have this, like, action scene kind of against this monster. And it's like, it doesn't fit. Nothing in this movie really works. And then the way it ended didn't really work either. It felt kind of like the humor behind it, to a certain extent, was kind of like, this is funny because things are not going well for the main character. But that's not funny by itself. So definitely something like The Adventures of Baron Munchausen is much better. Obviously Brazil. But I don't know, for a comedy, it needed to be, it needed to focus on a specific tone a little bit more, I think. If they wanted it to really be funny, play it up a little bit more, focus on the humor a little bit more, but don't draw out so many of the jokes so much. And maybe come up with a different story, because just this story didn't really, and I know this was after Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Again, I have not seen that movie, but it felt like maybe he was trying to kind of rely on that momentum a little bit, and that's why the setting was chosen, maybe. But I don't know. But definitely from what I've seen of Monty Python, that's definitely more overt of a comedy. This one's a little bit more toned down, and I think that's actually part of what held it back a little bit. So I wouldn't really recommend it either. I watched It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia season 13, which was from 2018.
Okay, I stopped watching this show a long time ago, but I liked it up until I stopped.
Yeah, so I had seen the first 12 seasons and liked them all a lot. And I'm guessing I probably had caught up to it before season 13 came out, and that's probably why I stopped. Because I remember watching the first episode of this season, I don't know how long after it aired, but I remember being really disappointed by it and thinking that was the first episode of the show that I didn't like, and thinking it wasn't funny. But I decided to go back and give it another shot, and I definitely liked it more the second time, and I obviously ended up watching the whole season. It's definitely past its prime, but it does get better. There are some episodes that I did like a lot. Specifically, there was a clip show episode, and they handled that in a really funny way. That was probably my favorite episode of the season, was the freaking clip show episode.
How did they do it?
It starts out seeming like it's going to be just a normal clip show episode, and you're like, oh, come on. And even then, it was making me say, like, oh, I remember that episode. That was a lot funnier than this season. But then they start throwing in things that never happened, and it starts becoming like, wait, you're remembering that wrong. And then people's memories start altering reality and stuff, and it was really goofy. And I liked it a lot. But it was making me realize part of the problem with this season is that the show has gotten a little too far from where it started, in terms of part of what made it funnier early on was that, as ridiculous as everything was, it still had a foot in reality. Like, part of what makes it funny is the idea of these people being this stupid in real life.
Right, and existing in the rest of the world, which is more normal.
Yeah, where other people have to interact with them, and you see other people's reactions and stuff like that. And that's part of what makes it funny. But it's gotten to the point where it's so over the top that at times, especially like with that first episode, that's part of what ruined it for me, is it just wasn't believable at all. It was going too far. And it was already, I remember thinking that even in the few seasons before that it was starting to cross that line a little too much. But it, like I said, it did have some good episodes. I liked Charlie's Home Alone a lot as well, where he's stuck in the bar by himself. So overall, I did enjoy it. I'm glad I went back, and I will keep going. But it's definitely not as good as it was earlier on. For anybody that wants to try it out, I would say start from the beginning. Don't try to, jump in where it is now. It does get better with season 2, where Danny DeVito shows up, but it's good right from the start, and it's really good for a long time. So finally, that's everything I watched. I read Death in Silver, which was the 20th Doc Savage story from October 1934. So you have a series of robberies being committed by these guys dressed all in silver. And pretty much right away, Doc Savage figures out that the robberies are actually a cover for a series of murders, because every time one of these robberies is committed, a bystander gets killed, and the bystanders are all connected somehow. And the villain's plan was freaking ridiculous. So it's all a scheme to drive up stock prices somehow, where I don't even remember what industry he was in, but he owns some company, and he tries to merge with this other company, but they say no. So he kills off the people, the owners of that company or whatever, and then buys them out, and then keeps driving up stock prices. It was absurd. So this was the first story where you don't have Doc's entire side cast of characters. You only have Monk and Ham, the two most popular ones. And part of why they're popular is because they're always arguing, and that's always entertaining. But they spend most of this book having been kidnapped. And you do also get Pat Savage, Doc's cousin, but she also spends most of the book having been kidnapped. So you focus almost entirely on Doc, and he does not have a personality. He's cool in terms of what he can do and whatever, but he's a boring character. So it was disappointing to focus on him like that. And it was unusual in that the entire story took place in New York City, where usually you'd go to some exotic location somewhere else in the world. And then it was also disappointing in that there wasn't really a big sci-fi or fantasy angle to it. It was mostly just regular stuff. The closest thing you had was a fight underwater where Doc has his super submarine and the bad guys have their submarine, and they put on diving suits and whatever, and then the bad guys have some kind of electric guns or whatever. That was the closest it came to kind of more what I was hoping for. It is action-packed pretty much the entire way through, but I still couldn't help being disappointed, mostly because, again, Doc's just a boring character to actually follow around for that long. And There's a twist at the end as to the identity of the villain, but I guessed it pretty early on. It doesn't help that he had basically done the same twist in an earlier Doc Savage story. This is still written by Lester Dent, who's written all the ones that I've read. So it wasn't one of the better ones. It wasn't one of the worst ones that I've read, but it was just okay. I read The Art of Ray Harryhausen by Ray Harryhausen and Tony Dalton. So this is a big coffee table book that came out in 2006. And I remember when this was announced and thinking, what the hell could they even put in that? Because they had already released An Illustrated Life, which was Harryhausen's memoir, plus he went like super in-depth into not just every movie that he worked on, but pretty much every effect sequence in every movie that he worked on. And I was thinking, what else how could you have enough to make another whole book? I was expecting a lot of double dipping, but they pretty much addressed that right at the beginning in the intro, where he says, as we were putting that other book together, we kept finding more stuff that I didn't even realize I still had, and we realized we might have enough for another book, and we tried not to overlap too much. And there is a little bit of overlap, but thankfully he's telling the truth. There's not that much. And it does focus a lot more on just the art, on his drawings and sculptures and stuff like that than the first book did. So there's still a lot of, thankfully for me, because I've told you before that I don't like art books that are just the art. I like to have comments from the artist or, background information. And you do still get that here, but it's much less text heavy than the first one was. And Harryhausen relies on his memory for a lot of things, which is kind of frustrating because he gets a lot of things wrong. Even when he's describing the movies that he worked on, it's like, yeah, that's not how that happened in that movie, which makes me wonder how accurate the other stuff is that he's talking about. So that's a little disappointing, but for a Harryhausen fan, I would still recommend it. I would say the first book, An Illustrated Life, it's way better, and that's a book that I would recommend to film people, fans of special effects, fans of like fantasy stuff. That book would have much wider appeal, and it's definitely much better. But this one I would still recommend to fans of Harryhausen, but this is definitely the companion to that one, which is the main book. And I thought it was funny that the back of the book, the text on the back, it says like Harryhausen, the special effects master behind such films as whatever. And it lists 4 movies, but only 2 of them are movies that he even had anything to do with. It mentions King Kong, which came out when he was like 13.
Right.
And The War of the Worlds, which he had nothing to do with. So whoever was putting the book together needed to look at that and say, yeah, this is not accurate. I read A Kiss Before Dying by Ira Levin, which was his first novel from 1953. So I've talked about Ira Levin before and how much I love Rosemary's Baby.
Well, that's good, because, the baby needs some love. It's got enough problems.
Uh-huh. I talked about Death Trap and how it was a really interesting movie. This book actually reminded me of that. This was a mystery thriller type book. At the beginning, you have a college student who gets his girlfriend pregnant, but he's only dating her for her father's money, and he realizes this is going to cause problems. So he starts scheming things and comes to the conclusion that maybe he's going to have to kill her. And I won't spoil the story beyond that. It was a good book. I would recommend it. The first half was absolutely perfect. I was so happy with it. I was ready to shout from the rooftops that this was a 10 out of 10. The second half, unfortunately, loses some of the momentum. There was a really cool thing he did about a third of the way in, where that entire first section it's in third person, but it's from that college student's perspective. But then you switch to another character who's trying to identify the first character. And as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, as soon as they give me that character's name, I'll as soon as they give me the names of the suspects, I'll know which one it was. But then they give me the names, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, I don't even know what that other guy's name was. So it was really cool because this second character is trying to identify the first one, but you also don't know which of the suspects is that first character. It was a really interesting narrative device that he used that really worked. I would kind of describe it as a gimmick, but it was a really effective gimmick. And for the majority of the book, it's consistently from one character's third-person perspective at a time. But then about halfway through, in the middle of a big tense scene where somebody could potentially die, he randomly inserts like just a line from a different character's perspective, and it was so casual and it fit so poorly that it made me wonder if he even did it by accident, didn't realize he had done it. And I, at the same time, though, while I was reading it, I was wondering if he did it on purpose, and it was supposed to give you some kind of clue or something. And I think maybe it was, but by the time the book was done, I was thinking about that, and it's like, yeah, that was a bad decision. That was what started derailing it a little bit for me. It was confusing. It was weird. It was inconsistent with the rest of the book. and it didn't add anything to it. So that was definitely a problem that the editor should have said, yeah, like just cut out these like literally like 3 lines maybe. And then later there's a big twist that comes right after a big shocking moment. But the twist was so confusing, and it gets explained, and it does all end up making sense. But it takes a few pages before you get to the explanation. So for maybe like 10 pages, I was thinking, I have no idea what's going on in this book anymore. I don't know who this character even is. It didn't work the way it was supposed to. It was too confusing. It was too big of a twist. It would be like watching a magic show where a magician puts, like the shell game where you put the ball under the cup and you move the cups around, and you're supposed to keep an eye on it and see which one it was. And you're like, okay, I think it's this one, but that's probably misdirect. It's probably this one. But then he pulls out a cup that you didn't even know was there, and it's under that one. And it was like, it was confusing. It didn't work. And then there's another, like, so many twists in a row to where it would be like if the ball, like, pulled out a gun and shot the magician. It's like, I don't even understand what's happening anymore. It was too much.
That would be awesome.
Yeah, but not when you're reading a book and you're trying to follow the plot.
Or like the magician himself turns into a cup.
Yeah, it was too much. So it did have some similarities to Death Trap in the way that he plays with the knowledge that the audience has of what's happening. And it was really interesting. And I would still really definitely recommend it. But that first half was so good. It was a little too ambitious, I think, in the second half. And then it doesn't help that toward the very end of the book, you get a scene change, a setting change to this factory, and part of what happens involves the way the factory is set up and the way it's run and everything. So he has to take the time to explain some of that to you. And it's kind of boring and a little bit like, without being able to see it, it's a little bit hard to follow. So it definitely lost a lot of momentum there at a crucial point because it's getting to the climax of the book. So I don't know. It was a little disappointing. Just a few little things that didn't quite work. But I would still highly recommend this book. And I didn't realize until after I read it that it's apparently been made into a movie twice. Once in the mid-50s and once in the early 90s. And I did look for those. I do want to check those out, but I couldn't find them anywhere right now. So I will keep an eye out for those. But definitely I would recommend the book. I read, and that's in quotation marks, Meddling Kids by Edgar Cantero, which was a novel from 2017. I put it in quotes because I technically didn't read the whole thing. I read about 2/3 of it before I gave up. This was a selection for a horror book club that I'm part of, and it was the worst thing I have tried to read in a long time. It was reminding me of, what was that book I talked about? The Wrong Stars. The Wrong Stars? I think that's what it was called, by Tim Pratt. That book was awful, and Tim Pratt was giving the characters all this faux clever, faux witty dialogue through the whole thing, and it was just painful to read. This book was kind of trying to do the same thing, but instead of in the dialogue, it was in the narration. So the concept is, clearly the title Meddling Kids is a reference to Scooby-Doo, which already is a bad sign, but you have this group of people that, as kids, were solving mysteries in their town, and there was this supposed monster case where it turned out it was a guy in a costume and whatever, but as adults, they start to think maybe there was a monster, we should go back and check it out. It doesn't really make sense the way things come together, and it turns out there's a lot of Lovecraftian stuff going on in the town and whatever. He throws in a lot of references to different horror things, but he doesn't do it in a good way. He does it in a way where it's like, hey, look at this reference. So there's references to like Resident Evil and Silent Hill and freaking, I don't even remember what else. Lots of different horror things. And it was too much. It was dumb. The writing was incredibly painful. It was trying so hard to be clever and cute. And it just, it irritated me so much. I made a note of some sentences, so I'm going to grab my Kindle.
Blatant product placement.
Here we go. Okay. He makes up a lot of words that are supposed to be clever and are just really insipid. Let me read you a handful of sentences.
I'm ready.
Try not to kill yourself.
Is that one of them?
No. Twice he describes an expression being declared on someone's lips. Or no, he says sketched, but he also says declared at one point. Here's one. Andy got out of the car, and even before caressing the asphalt skin of the street, she looked up at the house.
Oh, man.
Which, yeah, gives you the image of her literally getting down and, like, rubbing the sidewalk. But that's not... It's literally her just stepping out of the car.
It sounds like somebody went to, like, thesaurus.com or just said to an AI, use synonyms for these words.
Yes, the AI comparison is what... That was the feeling I was getting while I was reading it. One of the made-up words he used was tragichuckled. There was some kind of thing that this guy was like, oh, that sucks, but then he made like a joke or something, and he tragichuckled.
Oh, man.
Somebody shouts, whoa. Then she backtracked to make sure she hadn't put an exclamation point too many on there.
Was she texting?
No, this is talking out loud.
Oh.
But this is the narration trying to be clever. There are lots of times when it'll say, like, for the space of 2 paragraphs, they sat there and didn't say anything or something like that. Yeah. This one made absolutely no sense. I still don't know what it means. The night was cold but gentle like an X-rated metaphor. The f*** is that?
Hang on.
No, don't try to figure it out.
Hang on. Say it again.
I don't want to. The night was cold but gentle like an X-rated metaphor.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's just so clever. We just can't conceive. We can't do it.
Oh, that must be it. There's one character whose hair is anthropomorphized in the way it's described. So, like, if she lays down, it'll say, like, her hair sighed gently as she lay down to go to bed. Or, like, she spun around and her hair winked in the sun. Or, like, I don't know. Like, it's so dumb. Oh. A character is described as having piccoloed with how they screamed or something. I don't remember what the context was. Yeah.
How could you not finish this book?
It was painful. Andy went to the window and pushed the wardrobe in front of it. The colors inside the room went, oh, and became very sad.
No.
Yeah. Andy tried to sound as soothing as chemically possible. What the hell does that mean?
Oh, man.
Again, exclamation points. No, don't leave me. Okay, she conceded, alarmed by the returning exclamation points.
How old is this author?
He can't be older than, like, 11 on the inside.
I mean, it sounds like they're trying to appeal to the youth.
Yeah, it's like painful, like, TikTok audience style writing.
Yeah.
A blank meaning time-lapse... Oh, f***ing hell. A blank meaning time-lapse paragraph fire flew by.
Can you repeat that in English?
No. A character is described as thesaurusizing.
That sounds like the author to me.
Yeah. Oh, here's, she vaguely sketched a smile. Oh, f***ing hell. Pen and paper waited self-consciously on the side table, wondering if they should be doing something for themselves.
Oh, man.
No, Andy caps locked. And again, this is speaking out loud.
Yeah, this is like the author trying to appeal to all of the TikTok youth with their made-up words and shit, which every generation does, but trying so hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's getting worse, though, because of the internet, because of how easy it is for, like, made-up stuff to spread, and for people to be like, oh, that sounded cool, I'm going to use that. What I hate is when people use something in a very overt, look-at-me kind of way. Like, using a word that they're like, oh, that sounded cool, I'm going to sound cool if I use that, and then they use it. You know, not in, like, a natural way of, like, oh, this makes sense to just be how to describe this. And instead it's like, oh, look at me, I'm going to say, you know, whatever dumb thing.
Yeah, for sure. No cap.
Yeah, see, I don't even know what that means. and coincidentally, somehow cap is the first word in this sentence, which is a captain. Cap, where do you even keep all this stuff? Andy wondered, already alarmed at the size of the impedimenta parked on the anecdotic sidewalk.
Man.
Those words don't mean what the author thinks they mean.
Maybe you're just being salty.
Oh, f*** you. So yeah, that's... I made it 2/3 of the way through. I left off literally in the middle of a scene where they were being attacked by monsters. And I just said, you know what? I don't give a shit. Yeah, even in the middle of scenes like that, they would... Like, the author was trying to make it clever. I skipped ahead a little bit just to try to flip through to get to see how the plot came together. And I just realized I didn't care. But I saw a scene where they were fighting monsters. And for some reason, the monsters were... Like, in order to keep track of them or whatever, the character was naming them off with Greek letters. And it was like, Alpha came this way, and then, like, she shot Beta down this way, and, like, all this kind of... It was so dumb. If you want to... oh, man, this book was awful. Just don't read it. Don't read it. It was bad. It sucked.
Bet.
Right up there with The Wrong Stars as one of the worst books that I've either ever read or tried to read in my life. Okay, so that's everything I watched and read. I've been playing Skyrim. For people who have played it, I'm stuck on Solstheim, which is a DLC island. I thought it would be pretty short initially, but it's turned out to be pretty freaking long. and I'm getting tired of it. I guess, I don't know if how much of this started out as fan-made stuff, but at least some quests were originally fan-made, but that were made official by Bethesda or whatever. It's making me realize how much more I prefer Fallout, where, and I've said this before, where what I like about Fallout is that I can put myself in the game and say, what would I do in this situation? But too much of this part of Skyrim is missions where it feels like video game missions. It just feels like, which choice am I going to make based on, I don't know, just what do I want to play, or what kind of bonuses do I think I'm going to get or whatever. It's not something that I can play from kind of like a simulation perspective as much. And that's why I prefer Fallout. I do like the setting better for Fallout as well, and I like the combat better with the guns, but it's mostly that aspect of being able to put myself in my character's shoes that doesn't work for me as well in something like Skyrim. So I do still like it. I am going to keep playing, but this whole side area is really starting to kind of wear me down, and I just want to get it over with. So yeah, check out Skyrim. It's okay. So that's everything I did this month, finally. So what did you check out? And I hope it was better than most of my crap.
Yeah, you kind of had a me month there.
That's what I was thinking too. I was like, this feels like the kind of stuff that Nick is usually watching.
So imagine your rage and depression all the time.
That explains a lot about you, which is depressing in itself.
Straight up.
I mean, you're a freaking YouTuber and everything. Like, it doesn't get any sadder than that.
I don't know.
I guess you could be a TikToker. Yeah. So I guess it does get worse than that.
Is that what they're called?
I think so. I'm trying to think of what else you would call them.
I don't know. I'm sure they have some dumb name.
Yeah, they probably do. What's the Trekker and Trekkie? I'm not a TikToker, I'm a TikTokie. I'm sure some of them probably say that.
Okay. I don't have too much this month because I spent a lot of time traveling. I watched Wicked City from 1987. Are you familiar with this?
Is it an anime?
Yeah.
Then no.
It's based on a novel from 1985 where there's a whole other world full of demons and monsters, but everyone stays on their separate sides due to this treaty. But the treaty's going to expire, or it's getting revised or something, and the main character, this dude, is an agent for the secret police on our side, and he's assigned to protect an ambassador who was very helpful in ratifying the treaty the first time. And he's teamed up with an agent from the other side who assumes the form of an attractive woman. And the whole movie was pretty weird. There's a lot of monsters and demons and stuff because that's what's on the other side. And most of them start in human form and eventually end up as the Thing. There's even one guy whose head detaches from his body and gets the eye stalks and everything. The creativity in the design was cool. The action was well shot, and the horror tone was well realized. The animation wasn't bad. But this is a movie for adults. There is a lot of sexual violence and just sex in general. Story-wise, it's pretty standard fare. The ambassador is a strange drop of humor in an otherwise very serious plot. He's, hundreds of years old, and his whole shtick is being a lecherous old man that does everything he can to get laid.
Relatable.
So imagine you're watching The Thing, and they drop in Master Roshi.
Yay! Who's that?
Okay. People who are watching know what I'm talking about.
Is he the turtle guy?
Yeah.
Okay. See, I read most of Dragon Ball. I just don't remember the characters' names.
There's a twist at the end, and that's in quotes, because it's pretty expected.
Yeah, I mean, the plot feels just the description sounds very generic. I feel like there's a million things like that.
Yeah, I think what sets this one apart is, again, the sexual everything. Very mature. I'm sure if I had watched this in high school, it would have hit a lot differently than as an adult. There is a live-action version from 1992, and I watched the trailer, and I have no idea what the hell is going on. I can't make heads nor tails of anything it's showing, and it's a long trailer. But maybe that makes it worth checking out, just because it was so off the wall. And that's all I watched this month, outside of Batman Caped Crusader, which we have a separate video of. I read a book of 100 short stories, selected by Ray Bradbury, written by Ray Bradbury, from 1947 to 1996.
Interesting.
And I found out later that this is the second collection of 100 stories he put together. There's a whole other book of stories from 1943 to 1980. After this one, I kind of want to check out that one too. It's a pretty hefty tome, and I had time to read a lot because I was traveling so much. And even though there's so many stories, the writing style is consistent across the whole thing, and it was overall enjoyable. I was surprised at how few bread and butter, straight alien and horror stories there were. Many of them were instead focused on the humanity of the characters. It was pretty cool, too, to see recurring characters pop up, where if you weren't already familiar with other stories from other decades, from other publications, you wouldn't make those connections. I would say the strong themes throughout most of the stories were loss, whether it was something small and material to something huge, or even something intangible like childhood itself. And another one of the themes that was very prevalent was hope. Bradbury injects a lot of hope in his writing. Even if some of the endings don't turn out happy, the characters often maintain this sense of optimism. And there were those standalone stories that were very, very short, and they were just a simple idea, but very creative. And it was clear that he didn't want to try and expand them any further, which was fine, because if you don't have anything more to say, then why try to extend it needlessly?
Yeah, I'm glad you clarified at the end, because it's like, why try? But yeah, no, I agree.
And then I read Slaughterhouse-Five from 1969, which I assume you've read.
Yeah.
And it's a story about a dude who is pretty much a loser, who ends up fighting for the U.S. Army in World War II, but he also has a unique quirk of getting thrown through time, intermittently, out of his control, and he's also at one point abducted by aliens and put in a zoo. The writing style kind of gives me Hitchhiker's Guide vibes, even though the narrative itself is a totally different animal. I think the declarative and factual nature of the writing is what does it.
It's been a long time, but yeah, I could see that comparison.
I'd recommend it.
I think I would probably like it more if I read it again than I did back then. I was probably too young when I read it to really appreciate it.
I read 1984, which was written in 1949.
I thought it was 1948, because it was originally supposed to be called 1948.
Well, you learn something new every day. Quick summary for those who only have a cursory knowledge through pop culture or whatever. The world is in a constant state of war between three superpowers, and the novel focuses on a dude in one of them who is part of the working class, and everyone is under constant surveillance by the party, which is led by Big Brother, and anyone who steps out of line or is perceived to have stepped out of line, or who anyone suspects may eventually step out of line, is summarily removed from society, and all traces of them are wiped from existence. And history is rewritten constantly to conform to the present, so the actual truth of past events is unknown, and through fear, propaganda, brainwashing, everyone falls in line, even though the whole world lives in extreme poverty, and it just sucks. Things suck. But outside of most dystopian novels, I really enjoyed Orwell's explanation of the why and the how that everything was the way that it was. Because a lot of authors say, this is just how it is. You know, things happened. It was bad. There was a war. That removes the realism from it. But Orwell has huge sections explaining why everything is the way it is and how it continues to be that way. And he does it through the protagonist holding this hope that there's an underground resistance fighting the upper party. And eventually he finds some literature and other people supporting that notion. And they explain it. It's so probable that it's utterly depressing because it's not so far-fetched. It uses variables, events, and mindsets that are pretty much timeless since they deal with humanity and all of our failings. And since those are constants in our history, and will be until we eventually blow ourselves up, the book hits hard.
Interesting.
You disagree?
Yeah, I had completely the opposite reaction to it.
That's because you're brainwashed, man.
One of the things I didn't like about it, because the other thing was that it just goes on for, I thought it was way too long. It makes its points, and then it just keeps going and going, and the same scenes over and over again.
I only felt that way in the last quarter.
Yeah, because it's running out its welcome.
Maybe you just didn't like what it had to say.
To me, it felt so ridiculous and over the top. And I wish he had made it more realistic, and I felt like it was not realistic at all. From a, I don't know if you'd call it sci-fi, I guess from a sci-fi real-world perspective, the way the world works and the way the government works and the way that stuff works in that world was not plausible to me at all. I remember that ruining it for me. I hated that book.
I really like this book.
And I'm thinking now, I mean, it was a long time ago that I read it. I remember I read it right after reading Animal Farm. I did read Animal Farm back in school, but I didn't really remember it, so I read it again, and I liked it. I thought it was too short and that it needed to be, that it would have been better if it had been developed a little bit more. And then I read 1984 and felt like it was way too long, and was being basically the same thing, but stretched out way too much and just repeating itself over and over. And I liked it a lot less, again, because I thought it was not realistic. Not in terms of the themes and the way, the way people react to things, but in terms of the plausibility of the world as depicted in the novel. I thought, just for me, did not work at all.
This makes me think of our review on
The Drumhead. I knew you were going to say that.
Because we totally disagreed on that one, too.
Yeah, that one I thought was just super simplistic and stereotypically one-dimensional for Satie or whatever her name was. But in 1984, it was the plausibility of the development of the functionality of the world.
I think you have way too much faith in humanity, which is weird because you're such a pessimistic person in general.
I have no faith in humanity. What are you talking about? I did not buy into the practical depiction of that world. You're making me think maybe I should read it again so that I can more concretely explain to you why you're wrong.
I mean, I'm always up for a discussion. That will come out, a year after we discuss it.
When you're like, oh, I don't remember that book anymore.
But back to the narrative, the constant notion that nothing and no one can be trusted looms over everything. And of course, things don't end well. And it's even more depressing because the main guy holds on to the sense of hope that is completely expunged because of the hopelessness of his struggle. And he just caves. And they did the movie with John Hurt. What year was that? Was that actually in 84?
I think so, yeah.
John Hurt's a good actor, but I like the book more than the movie. I think because there was so much explaining of the philosophy that if they tried to do it in the movie, it would make the movie very long.
So like the book.
I also read Animal Farm.
Okay.
Which was published in 45, so a few years before 1984. And I look at this as like the kid version of 1984.
Yeah, like a more simplified version.
Yeah, and whereas 1984 goes through a lot of explanation of why people think a certain way, Animal Farm sums it up by just saying, kind of almost writing it off, like the animals couldn't really wrap their heads around it because they're all stupid.
Is that not realistic?
Well, animals are stupid.
Not the bees.
Not the bees.
And for when you're editing this later and don't remember what that's about, the movie I talked about had the bees gaining intelligence.
Yeah, I remember right now.
Yeah, but you won't remember in 20 years when we get to this.
I'm not as smart as a bee. What can I say? With my luck, I'll just go Vincent Price and only get as far as a fly.
That was David Hedison, though, that played the fly.
So this was another fight against an unfair and uncaring regime, but this time it's successfully replaced by a righteous one in an uprising, but then the righteousness becomes twisted until it eventually devolves back into another regime. And it was a much easier read, and they made that animated version in the 50s that was funded by the CIA, and I talked about that a few months ago. And that completely changes the ending to fit the agency's desired narrative. And they made that live action version in the late 90s, which also changes the ending to be more upbeat, which is silly.
And ironic, given the themes of controlling and everything and manipulation.
Yeah. Overall, while the book was depressing, it was less depressing, even though the themes were the same. I thought they were both really good reads, though. Apparently, you didn't like either.
Yeah, that's interesting. I found Animal Farm way more depressing because it felt way more real, even though the characters are animals. 1984, I couldn't see as anything but like an allegory. I don't know. It didn't. There wasn't a sense of realism to it for me at all.
You just wait.
1984 already passed. I know, these videos come out so late.
So they'll probably do a remake and it'll be called 2084.
No, see, at that point, we will be living in that world, and their nightmare version will be like, a utopia.
I guess we'll just have to wait and see. And the last thing I read was Alley from 2024, which was originally published in 2011 and is a collection of Junji Ito stories. Typical fare. Not to say that is a bad thing. They were all enjoyable, but typical in that something weird happens unexpectedly, whether it's an external event, like people inexplicably falling up and then a couple days later all just falling back down and smashing into the ground, or something through a person, like this dude gets possessed to dig a hot spring in the middle of his house because he's convinced there's water down there and he's going to turn his house into a hotel, and he drives his family away, and it turns out that the hole does lead to a hot spring, but it's a hot spring in hell, so there's demons and shit coming out of it, but people still stay at this hotel. So I don't know. Or people being dumb, like smoking cigarettes with tobacco grown next to a crematorium, so whenever they exhale, all this black smoke comes out of their eyes and shit. But they keep doing it.
Is that like an anti-smoking story?
No, they really liked it. There were a few stories in here I could have sworn I read somewhere else before, but I guess it's kind of a good problem to have that so much of his stuff has been translated over the past few years. Seems like Viz drops a new collection every few months.
Yeah, I know in Japan there's a line of, I want to say there's 11 books in that line. Lately, they've been basically just collecting the books and, doing a straight port over to English. So the first two were the Tomie in 2 volumes, and then they've put out at least 3 or 4 of the other ones. So they still have a decent number to go.
Yeah, I think the Viz ones right now all have the Junji Ito story collection emblem on them.
Okay.
But yeah, it was good. And I think one of his more approachable ones. Because some of them are just so weird. Like you have to be familiar with some of his other work and how he writes.
Yeah, like I think of Fragments of Horror, and I remember being really disappointed by it. But I think if I went back and read it now that I'm more familiar with him, I might like it more.
And that's everything I did this month.
No video games?
I've been digging into Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, but I'm going to save that for next month because that game is absolutely gigantic.
Okay. And in contrast to all the crap I talked about this month, I should have at least one good book to talk about next month.
What was the name of the shitty book this month with the weird language?
Meddling Kids, which I've been referring to as middling shit.
That's clever.
I know.
Speaking of middling shit, thanks for watching our video.
We'll definitely keep going with these. We're going to keep going in general.
So if you know any sponsors...
Don't bother with Cheetos or Crush, because we already tried those. They didn't work out.
Turns out if you shit on a product, they don't want to sponsor you.
I used to like Cheez-Its until they stopped giving us money.
I like the extra cheesy and the hot and spicy.
Oh, quit trying to placate them. They're not going to come back. I heard Cheese Nips are pretty good.
Whatever. Those are like the bootleg versions of Cheez-Its. Your product sucks. And they're triangles, I think, aren't they?
No. I like Cheese Nips.
I thought Cheese Nips were triangles.
No, they're exactly the same. They're just like a millimeter smaller or something.
I'm looking it up.
I like Cheese Nips. I like Cheez-Its too. I think having variety is good.
Okay, now I'm searching Cheese Nips triangles.
You're going to find like some Chinese knockoff or something.
That's what Cheese Nips are! I can't find anything, but man, maybe it was an alternate reality. Or maybe Big Brother just wiped it out. We're already living in it. Thanks for watching.